We acknowledge that the land the Go Open Data Association is webcasting from is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto was built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and extended to allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it. Good morning. It's May the 5th, 2023, and it is that time again, the Good Conference 2023. My name is Keith McDonald. A pleasure to be here today. I'm past Director of Communications for the Go Open Data Association, currently involved with the Literacy AI project. I'm Chief Cook and Bottle Washer there to spread AI literacy across the land, coming to a community near you, I hope, sometime in the future. And it's wonderful to kick off the conference again. I'm going to be your host, moderator for most of the morning and into the early afternoon. And I wanted to start with lightening things up, get you comfortable and so on. So a couple of words. We had hoped to do the conference with people in the room this year. We did some investigations and actually had a room book, but we realized when we heard most of our speakers were actually going to come in virtually that you'd all be sitting in the room watching two large screens. So we thought, really, in thinking about it, it made more sense to just go virtual. So we'll see what happens in the future. There will be an event in June that you'll hear about, which will be an in-person event. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. As well, during COVID, right, I think a lot of us spent some time that we had learning some things that maybe we didn't have time to do before. I know in my own case, I learned a bit about watchmaking. I can change batteries and band lengths and things like that. So that was fun. But I also always wanted to learn to be a ventriloquist. So I made an effort to do that. So I'm going to debut today. Of course, I do have to put my mask on. Now, the reason for that, of course, is because I learned during COVID and I really can't do it without my mask on. This is my buddy. So this is Jay. Hi, Jay.
Hello, how are you?
And Jay, you have a few words for us, I think.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. You know, they say, Keith, you get to be the moderator of the Go Open Session conferences 2 times in your career. First on the way up and then on the way back down. It's good to have you back. A tough crowd. Okay. So a few words about the Toronto Maple Leafs, because, you know, they lost last night and it's 2-0 for them. You know, the Leafs are the quintessential Canadian team. Why? Because they're always saying sorry. Tough crowd. Okay. The other thing is, I know that in your will, you asked for the Leafs to be pallbearers at your funeral.
That's right.
All right. Well, you know why that is. You wanted them to let you down one more time. Tough crowd. Okay. And also the name GOOD, the short form for Go Open Data, is very good because, you know, I get to say to you, Keith, how you doing? And you say, good. Yes, and I say I'm good. And then I say to all of you, are you good? Everybody's good. So it's good. All right. Now, next, without any further ado, what is adieu anyway? People always say that. I think it's the French, you know, I bid you adieu. So it means before I say goodbye, I'm going to introduce the person. So here we go. This is our executive director of the Go Open Data Association. And his name is spelled Jury. A lot of people pronounce it jury, you know, as if you're on a jury. But it's actually Yuri. Yuri is how we pronounce it. So ladies and gentlemen and others, I'd like to introduce you to the executive director for a welcoming speech, Mr. Yuri Konga. Put your hands together. Applause, Yuri! Yes, Yuri Konga! Take it away, Mr. Konga!
Wow, I wasn't expecting that, but Keith is always full of surprises. So thank you, everyone. And on behalf of the Go Open Data Association Board of Directors and Operation Committee, I'm delighted to welcome you to GOOD23, our 10th annual conference. I'd like to acknowledge our team for their contributions throughout the year, Sandra Crutcher, the treasurer, David Polt, the secretary, Keith McDonald, our MC and former director of communications, Connie McCutcheon, current director of communications, Mai Fan, the director and lead for diversity, equity, and inclusion. New directors, Paul Steves, Ushnish Sengupta, and Dennis Carr and Jamie Leach, who recently joined the board. We also have from our operations committee, Jonathan Brown, the director of education, Nathan Childs, our technology lead and man behind the scenes for the conference, Daryl Bridge and Cody Brown. These are special people who make good special. So thank you to all of those tiers. We'd also like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors whose financial support assists us in putting on this conference. The gold sponsor is TELUS Business. Bronze sponsors are MISA Ontario and Be Spatial Ontario, and community sponsors being Open North Community Foundations of Canada and Code for Canada. Our conference theme this year is bridging the open divide. And the open ecosystem is quite expansive with focal points including open government, open data, open dialogue with leading principles of transparency, accountability, and being participatory. The open divide may be viewed from many perspectives, including moving from principle and policy to action, being accountable for monitoring, execution of policies, being transparent and open, yet ensuring privacy and expanding open to a broader community to assist in developing sustainable community well-being. Yesterday, we had 4 great workshops that provided insights into the Open Government Partnership Local, Artificial Intelligence, the Periodic Table for Open Data, and Digital Twins. And today we have a really diverse program, which includes a trio of keynote speakers and panels on data equity, growing open, diversity of open, open futures, and an exciting lineup of lightning talks. We're delighted to see new people joining us this year. GOOD has traditionally been based in Ontario as an in-person event, but this year for our 3rd virtual conference, we're happy to have a Canada-wide audience and global participants from Europe, the US, and South America. So GOOD is a small grassroots nonprofit that continues to grow by expanding our education programs. There were 12 events last year, increasing the organizations that we collaborate with, and adding to our roles in the open data community. Of particular note is our collaboration with the Canadian Open Data Society, which will be elaborated on by Paul Konga, COD's executive director, in his lightning talk. Specifically, I'm pleased to announce that we are actively developing an open data certification program in collaboration with CODs, including continuing education credit requirements, and that includes GOOD23 credits that will be provided to all of the registrants. So as has been our tradition in the past, in lieu of speaker and moderator gifts, we are providing a total of $500 in donations to worthwhile charities. This year, we find our community is suffering from food insecurity in many parts of the province. The increasing use of food banks needs support, and GOOD will be donating to Feed Ontario, the province's largest collective of hunger relief organizations. So thank you to all speakers, moderators, facilitators, and their supporters, and thank you for your attendance at GOOD23, and we hope that you enjoy it. Thank you again, and back to you, Keith.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Nice words of welcome. And next, we'd like to get some words of welcome from the province. I'd like to introduce to you our next person. And before I say his name, I'll give you his title. He's the Associate Deputy Minister, Deputy Chief Digital and Data Officer, the Chief Privacy Officer and Archivist of Ontario, Ministry of Public and Business Service Delivery. Please welcome John Roberts.
Thank you, Keith, for those kind words of introduction. That job title must be one of the most longest and most cumbersome around government, I'm afraid. But you'll take from those various roles that I have why I'm so excited to have the opportunity to say a few words today, because data, digital, privacy, archives, all obviously central to the open data world. Before I talk any further about what we do, I would like to repeat Yuri's words of thanks to all of the volunteers and organisers who've made this event possible. And I say that very genuinely because it's an event where we from the province's team do get a unique opportunity to talk about what we do and to participate and collaborate with all of you in terms of building a provincial approach to open data and open government that is participatory in its nature. And as we look at the theme this year around bridging gaps, bridging that divide, it's really critical that we have all of the parties. A divide is between two or more areas. So without bringing different groups together, how can we talk meaningfully about bridging divides? Ontario's work in this open data space does continue, and I have to say the OGP has always been an incredibly valuable forum for us to work through the value importance of open data, prioritise our work, and the commitment in open government partnerships to co-design of action plans, I think is a really important part, and a part of how we demonstrate our genuine commitment to collaboration, transparency, and openness. For Ontario, we have been a formal member of the Open Government Partnership 2016, and very proud to be one of only 2 subnational partners in Canada. And the forum that OGP provides for us to continue working on our program is, as I say, incredibly valuable for us. Those of you who have looked at the province's action plan will note that there's a key part of that is around how do we share information around responsible use of AI. That item that was put in perhaps quite presciently when the plan was developed quite a while back has become ever more important. And at the moment, that understanding about what transparent, responsible use of AI looks like, what it means, how that is impacted by the data that is available for the AI ecosystem continues to be a really important part of our commitment around open government. Trustworthy use of AI has to start with transparent and open statements about how and why AI is being used in government. And that builds on our commitments to a user-centered approach across digital matters, whether it's working in the open and designing approaches, whether it's participation, whether it's user research in the tools and solutions we build, or a user-centered approach to understanding how artificial intelligence usage can strike the balance between maximizing the very real benefit of machine learning and artificial intelligence solutions, but also actively and meaningfully managing the potential for misuse, for discrimination, for bias and the like. And we can only strike that balance where there is collaboration, and that comes from events like this where it's not just government talking to itself, but with others around the table. Looking back over the last couple of years, I'd have to say that through the time of the pandemic, through COVID, the value and the appetite for open data was definitely proven. And through COVID-19, we really saw how important it was to be delivering timely, regular access to quality data about the unfolding situation through our data catalogue. And whether that was up-to-date public health data or access to services, access to vaccines, so many of the responses to the pandemic were at heart based on transparency and accurate, up-to-date information available to the public in easy to use ways. And that's not to say we got everything right first time around. The collaborative approach, the importance of user research was a key part of evolving the approaches along the way. And now we've taken many of those lessons on board as we plan for our action plan going forward. One of the key lessons was that we can't just do open data for the tech savvy, for the digitally advanced consumers. We need to understand how the general public, how journalists, how the society at large can understand and gain access to information relevant for them living their lives and making adjustments. Again, that theme of bridging the open divide has been demonstrated in practice. So our vision remains to be a leader in open data, a vision that is articulated in our 2021 digital and data strategy and continues to be at the heart of the work that we do. Whether that's our work on trustworthy AI, artificial intelligence that Ontarians can trust, that is not used in secret, and it does serve all Ontarians in a meaningful way. And I'd like to ask everybody here to continue to provide input to us as we build that out. But as we go forward over the rest of the day into the sessions and look at the various themes that are emerging, again, I'd just like to thank everybody for your collaboration with each other, with us, with Good, and in the context of the Open Government Partnership for really building a robust discourse around how open data can help Ontarians thrive. Bridging the open divide needs to be a collaborative endeavour, and it starts in spaces like the forum that we have today. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for providing this place where my team can come and participate in debate, learn, and share ideas. And I wish everybody a very successful day discussing open data and taking steps to bridge that open divide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate your comments as well about general public folks, be it mechanics, hairdressers, cashiers, teens, parents, moms, dads, granddads. I mean, I think you're right. We have to make sure that we don't keep it too inside baseball, as they would say. So thank you again, John. Appreciate your welcome. And we'll move right into our keynotes. Why not, right? Just going to get it to my scan here. Yes, we've got 3 speakers for us this morning, and they will go in the following order. We have Brenda McPhail, Rudi Borrmann, and Jonathan Dewar. And I'm going to introduce Brenda first, who will go first, and we'll end up then with a bit of a discussion after all 3 have spoken. So Brenda McPhail is the Director of Privacy Surveillance and Technology Program, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She's Acting Director, Master of Public Policy in Digital Society, McMaster University. So please welcome Brenda McPhail. You now have the floor, Brenda.
Thank you. Good morning. It is genuinely an honor to be here today. Thank you so much to Yuri and the organizers for inviting me. It's particularly a privilege because to the extent that anyone has heard of me at all, it's likely that you know me as a privacy advocate rather than an open data advocate. Although I'm going to argue today it's entirely possible to be both. In my almost 10 years as the founding director of the Privacy Technology and Surveillance Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, I spent a lot of my time advocating for stronger and more effective privacy laws to protect people across Canada from emerging and evolving technological incursions into their lives. And in my new role at the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster, I'm hoping to teach the next generation of policymakers how to critically engage with technology and its impacts, including, of course, the benefits of open data to society and the impacts of privacy in relation to technological change and evolution. I think everybody in this audience fundamentally agrees that data can be a force for good. It can help solve problems, contribute to, in English, sustainable communities, improve public services like healthcare, basically help create a better society, the kind of place we all want to and deserve to live in. I believe that too. It needs to be done well and with due attention to protecting all of our human rights, including the right to privacy. But as a privacy advocate, I think too often that privacy can be seen, particularly in the larger community outside the extremely informed audience that we have here today. Privacy is sometimes seen as a barrier to open data initiatives, even used like a bludgeon to shut down attempts to use information for public good. but it's not, or at least it shouldn't be. I genuinely think the two, privacy and openness, can and should work together in fundamental ways. And of course, that's not the provocative statement in 2023 that it would have been in 2013 when the G8 Open Data Charter didn't even mention privacy. The open data community has been engaging responsibly and intensively with privacy concerns for a long time now. But I have to say, I've still been in or adjacent to conversations where privacy felt more like it was being used as a 4-letter word than a 7-letter one. Privacy is a fundamental human right. That's why it matters. It's recognized in international treaties. It's read into our Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a quasi-constitutional right, not just under Section 8, our right to be free of unreasonable search and seizure, but also our Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. Why? Because having a zone of privacy in which we can go about our business, be that business trivial or consequential, public or intimate, being able to do that with dignity and autonomy has been deemed by many, including our Supreme Court, as fundamental to the way that we should expect to be able to live in a democracy. It also matters because privacy is an enabling right, most particularly in the data context, a way to defend equality rights and equity rights, because information about protected characteristics should never be used by people or machines to judge us in discriminatory ways. And I have to say, I'm very much looking forward to the sessions on equity and diversity today here at this conference. In our click-wrap society, where we're asked to hand over reams of information about ourselves every time we click accept to download an app or use a website, members of the public are being encouraged to think about privacy as a convenience, to be traded for another convenience we may want more in that moment. And there are all kinds of systems discouraging us from thinking farther ahead than the 3 seconds it takes to click yes. And yet, people, the members of the public, are catching on that this is a problem. So data collected by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada suggests that in 2020, only 11% of people surveyed were not concerned about how companies or organizations might use personal information about them. And part of the rising public awareness is probably because we've all read the stories about the impacts this click and don't ask questions approach to our personal information is having. Tim Hortons tracking real-time location data in an app meant to help you order your morning double-double. Home Depot sharing personal information with Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, for customers who agreed to receive e-receipts, but who were not asked for their consent for the information on those receipts to be disclosed to a social media giant. Clearview AI, a US company making facial recognition software for police and scraping 5 billion plus images off the internet as matching sources, putting a significant proportion of the world's online population into a perpetual police lineup without their knowledge. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, casting back a few years, where a quiz was used to collect info from a few 100,000 people who consented to download it, and then around 50 million of their friends who got caught up in policies that at the time allowed third parties to scoop up friends list data, which you would think was old news, except that the Federal Privacy Commissioner in the last few weeks just lost a significant case trying to hold Facebook account for that debacle, in part because the court took seriously the idea that our outdated private sector privacy law is not meant to protect privacy as a human right, but rather to balance individual and commercial interests in the use of personal information. So in this fraught environment where we regularly hear about ways that large-scale data collection enhances the potential to do things that feel creepy to people, and which the law seems unable to properly prevent, when the organizations we thought we could trust, Timmy's, let us down, then the problem for open data becomes one of social license, even for uses of data in ways that are open, accountable, transparent, and publicly beneficial. That environment that feels like we're losing or have already lost control of information about ourselves, and that consequential decisions about our lives, whether they're about services we're entitled to or benefits we deserve, all the way down to what ads we get served, bail bonds, Alexis, is a significant factor creating friction for more open data and more effective uses of open data. It's not privacy's fault. It's a demonstrable lack of enforceable legal protection and effective data governance that's making people anxious. It's the growing awareness that big data activities, whether they're built around identifiable data about us hey, Keith, you deserve a mortgage, or de-identified or anonymized data that can be used to categorize us or predict things about us. Okay, people like Keith deserve a mortgage, people like Brenda don't. Whether it's either of those things, it's going to impact us. And it impacts us whether we can track that impact back to a proprietary data set or an open data set that fed any particular algorithm. Which is why I think this moment is very important for the open data community, because we have two significant pieces of legislation in play that have just in the last week or so gone through second reading and been sent to committee to study. Both the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which are two of the three parts of Bill C-27, are going to have impacts on the degree of faith that members of the public are going to be able to have in private sector uses of their information. And by extension, public sector uses of that information, because those boundaries are increasingly blurred, particularly in the world of AI. In the CPPA, de-identified information is now explicitly within the scope of the law, and there are flawed provisions that attempt to facilitate public sector uses of that information in the context of public good applications. There's a good impulse there that's badly executed. It's really a shame that the law is more permissive than protective. I won't go into detail here. I simply encourage members of this community to engage with that legislation. If you see places where its faults impact your interests as a community, it's really important to speak out. Now is the moment. The policy window is closing quickly. I apologize for the puppy in the background. I'm going to go on over top of her. Similarly, the Artificial Intelligence Act is a skeleton rather than a fully fleshed out piece of legislation. It leaves to regulation even the definition of core concepts like what a high impact system is. The PR on the bill that Canada is acting fast to provide reassurance that people need to trust AI innovation. The reality is that the federal government failed to act for the last few years, even as they touted the importance of AI to our economy, and now we're playing catch up. But we can't let the need for speed outweigh the imperative to craft a knowable law with protections we can count on. Yuri asked me to consider how civil society and academia can help bridge the open divide. And my pitch to you this morning is that one way is through shared attention to and taking up shared interest in the context of legal reforms for privacy. Strong, effective privacy laws, if they're well conceived, don't have to be restrictive laws. What they have to be is principled and enforceable. And even if people in this room might disagree with me or each other over the precise guardrails and safeguards we need, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we probably all agree that we need some, and we need to build on that common ground, because good privacy laws create public trust in uses of data. Social license is facilitated by public trust. Social license, in turn, is a precondition to social embrace of public good applications of data and to the expansion of open data initiatives throughout the public sector and to sharing initiatives between public and private sector bodies. Here's the specific ask. The clerk of the Indu Committee of Parliament is accepting the name of witnesses who want to appear and speak to the privacy law and the AI law right now. I'm sure there are people in this room who have wisdom and expertise to bring to bear in that process. There I'll conclude. I'm very much looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists and participating in the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. You've given us lots of rich things that we can talk about. Absolutely. Moving right along, however, as we keep rolling along for this morning, I'd like to introduce Rudi Borrmann, who is the Deputy Director of the Open Government Partnership, or OGP. We heard John refer to OGP. It's the Open Government Partnership, and he's a local representative. So, Rudi, come on in.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you to Yuri and Jonathan, John, and Brenda. Super happy to be here today in this legacy conference, I would say, because it's a tradition already. For many of us who have been working in open government, we know what this conference entails. So very happy to be here to share a little bit on this discussion around the data divide. one central element that can definitely help to close that divide is the local level. We are seeing with great enthusiasm from the Open Government Partnership and working with several organizations globally how local is gaining momentum, not only for transparency issues, but immediate and emergency issues like climate, housing, migration, mobility will require solutions that are database and community-based, and the local level, the local that it's closer to the citizens, is definitely the space where we need to work better, look better, improve evidence, improve the data that we need to solve these very wicked problems in different ways. So today I'm going to share with you a small presentation to share with you some numbers on what we are seeing from the Open Government Partnership. As you know, we feel that we are a platform that basically help governments and civil society who wants to thrive in open government. We are not the center of open government. Open government is what you do. We are just partners to help promote and accelerate those who really want to thrive in open government. So let me quick share my screen. I have a very short presentation to share with you. There we go. So OGP local, as you know, Rudi was talking a little bit, and John also was talking about this. Around 5 years ago, OGP started to work more at the local level. We are originally a platform formed by countries. We were created 10 years ago, 11 years ago, sorry, in the margins of the UN General Assembly as a platform to promote open government, but made mostly by countries. With the evolution of the program, local became something that keep popping up, rather in national action plans that were including locals, or locals that were interesting to start doing open government at the local level. So around in 2019, basically the decision was to start expanding our membership for local governments and simplifying and changing a little bit all of our rules to make it more agile and adaptable to the local level that is usually quite faster and agile than national levels. So from the first group of 5 pioneers doing local, we now have 106 local members in the program. So let me let's go to the presentation and see some numbers. Here you can see the countries that are members of the partnership, our local members, the amount of action plans they have done. As you know, every member of the partnerships needs to develop an action plan in a series of time. Those action plans include commitments. Those commitments are followed and tracked, and the whole process for producing those action plans and those commitments is done in a public and participatory way in what we call a co-creation process. Which sometimes it's a little bit complicated. No, some governments are not even prepared to work with external audiences and develop these projects with citizens, with organizations, etc., etc. So here you can see our policy areas, our trending policy areas, with the amount of commitment that have been made until now. So you can see here a variety of themes that have been evolved in OGP, with fiscal openness, public service delivery, inclusion, justice as one of the more relevant. Yesterday we were also sharing a little bit about open data commitments, that also a very prominent area of work. Another thing that helped us to accelerate our work at the local level was that the results and the evidence, at least from the first batch of locals from 2019 to 2019, was that the results of performance of these locals running different projects of open government within the framework of OGP were better than nationals. No, we saw more ambitious commitment, better completion at the local level, and stronger results. So this is something that we are eager to see how under the new model what sort of numbers we have, but the early results show a very positive trend coming from the local level. All the commitments that are made in OGP are basically, or needs to be aligned with our 3 core principles, which are access to information, accountability, and citizen participation, right? Technology and innovation is basically an enabler. But these 3 principles are the ones that define open government to us. So every commitment that we do needs to be rooted on one of these 3 principles, but can be applied to a different series of policies within the action plan, as we have seen in time, and you can see here like a great variety of thematic areas. But each of these areas in the action plan needs to be connected to accountability principle, or an access to information value, or a public participation angle. So this is the connection, the most important connection, and the sort of center when our members start thinking about these projects. John was talking about the commitment about these consultations that are made on AI policy. So we could put that into digital governance as a theme, but includes a strong public participation component, which is basically consult citizens about this policy that the government is writing, and what are going to be probably the accountability measures for that, or the access to information to understand what kind of algorithms are going to be running, etc., etc., etc. So 3 principles, a big range of thematic areas. If you are a little bit of a data nerd, I'm sure many of you here are, we have just launched something called the OGP data dashboard. It's on a beta version. So all suggestions, please send it to us. Happy to improve it, but basically has all the information from all across the commitments, nationals, locals, themes, and you can explore and see, basically play around the data, and then take a look into what commitments have different countries have done, or locals have done on different types of areas. So if you like this tool, it's really useful. Quick reminding, the OGP cycle, right? This is something also we like to remind. This is something that works exactly the same at the national, local level. Basically, our members that decide to co-create an action plan, that decide to do implementation also in a public way, also are going to be evaluated in order to create more learning on the process and improve those cycles of co-creation and consultation, not for the OGP itself. These are capacities and abilities that you will get as government or as a non-governmental organization participating. So for us, it's very important that the evidence and these cycles of learning, it's something that we dedicate a lot of time as part of the OGP cycle. Open government is a path. It's not an objective, a destiny. So it's always improving, always learning, and as a community of practice, we try to connect our members as much as possible with other similar examples or similar interest to promote that global community of practice. This is a little bit how the co-creation process goes. This is just a suggestions of the different steps that start basically by building a team, like sitting down with civil society and non-governmental stakeholders like academia, private sector, religious, cultural, economic cooperatives, different type of organizations operating in the public life, and basically run a process where there is a selection of certain priorities, an ideation process, open consultation, then it's cleaning a little bit those ideas and see how can they be an action plan refined and possible to make open government more real in the local or national government. So this is a little bit an example graphic of that process. So just to my last slides, what's in the 2022 local action plans. This was a suggestion by my colleague Rudi to show a little bit of this. We take a look in all the action plans and 30 action plans that were presented last year. Those 30 action plans included 101 commitments. And what we saw there, it's basically that there were two big cross-cutting themes across the plans, were public participation and open data in different ways, publishing data in different ways, different entry points for public participation, and then very specific policy areas that pop up last year on the plans. As you can see here, inclusion, public service, green transitions, fiscal openness, right information, public procurement, justice. In my humble opinion, I think we are still a long way to go in terms of including more and more themes that are relevant for the local level. The open government narrative globally still is very much attached to big national issues. But little by little, what we are seeing is that more close to citizens, close to the ground type of themes are starting to appear. And I was mentioning migration, I was mentioning mobility, I was mentioning the housing crisis. All these issues are starting to be more real, and this is something that we are learning with our community in order to show that open government can definitely be applied to local concerns, local models, and local issues, especially regarding the services that governments are given. And I think everyone will agree that during the pandemic, we learned this in a very hard way, how the last mile of services was definitely at the local level, and how important it's that these teams are equipped with the capacity to run that. So I'm going to finish here, basically to share with you our last research work. These are publications from our research team. If you want to check them out, are here, and invite everyone, of course, September 6 and 7 to Tallinn. Our OGP Global Summit will happen there. So I hope Keith and your little friend that was there will be invited as well to come. And thank you very much. Sorry for the long introduction. I hope this was useful for an introduction to what we are seeing from OGP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudi. Awesome. Just a reminder, you need to, quit share. Okay, thank you. Yes, excellent, Rudi. And I just want to note there's some stuff happening in the chat, not specific questions yet. You can please add them as we go, because we are going to have a bit of Q&A. But also Brenda has provided a link to the Committee for Witness Protection Act, I guess. And I encourage people to actually follow that link. I know I'm going to. I've been waiting for that moment. But we still have one more speaker, and this is Jonathan Dewar, who's Director General and Vice President, Collections Research, Exhibitions and Reparation, Canadian Museum of History. And looking forward to what you have to say. Jonathan, welcome, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Keith. And I think I'm in the competition for longest job title, but we can swap business cards virtually later to determine that. Thank you very much for having me. I'm actually rejoining you. I had the pleasure of speaking at a previous version of this conference in 2019. And I'm going to revisit some of what I talked about in 2019 because it remains extremely relevant and, of course, integral to the conversations we're having today, whether it's the open conversation, open data, open government, open science, the privacy conversation, the broader Canadian information governance regime, Indigenous data sovereignty is the topic of my 2019 talk, is essential. I'll start by saying this, though. Thank you to the organizers for the land acknowledgement. I'm joining you from the unceded, traditional, and contemporary territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, also known as Ottawa or the National Capital Region. My own First Nations roots extend to the community of Wendake, that's the Huron-Wendat Nation, through my mother and maternal grandmother. And I'm going to talk today about the work that I did over 5 years, leading an amazing team of people, my now former colleagues, at the First Nations Information Governance Center, because these questions were absolutely essential to the work we did over those 5 years. As you know from my introduction, my job title is now Director General and Vice President of Collections, Research, Exhibitions, and Repatriation at the Canadian Museum of History. These issues we're talking about, of course, extend to that work I now do with my new colleagues at the Canadian Museum of History. It's a different context, but the broader context we'll talk about absolutely apply in essential ways. And I'm going to try to thread the needle on connecting a number of dots here. So as I said, I'm going to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty or sovereignties. I'm coming from largely a First Nations perspective, having led the work at this national organization, the First Nations Information Governance Center. I hope many of you are familiar with it. You will certainly be familiar with elements of its work as we talk about the principles that underpin the way that First Nations and more broadly, Inuit and the Métis Nation approach questions to open data, open government, and or open science. So I'm going to start with a bit of a caveat. Obviously, when I was doing that work with the First Nations Information Governance Center, I was directly accountable to First Nations, and so a spokesperson for the work of that organization. But at the same time, carrying responsibilities with direct accountability is a particular context within which one works. So throughout this conversation, I'll make some points and defer back to my now former colleagues at FNIGC for the work that they continue to do with and on behalf of First Nations. I'll defer to Métis Nation governments. I'll refer to Inuit governments and organizations and the work that they do. I'll speak broadly about issues that I had the pleasure and the privilege of working to advance and then try to connect some dots. I'm going to start with nomenclature. So the term Indigenous data sovereignty, or as I said, sovereignties, is a really important term, certainly in the international context, certainly in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is an essential document and one that people need to read and understand, and then dive much deeper into their national, regional, sub-regional, and local contexts. And if that sounds like a messy complexity, it is by necessity. It's no more complicated, though, than the Canadian Federation and the issues of jurisdiction, the issues of federal legislation, the issues of provincial and territorial legislation, and how that impacts Canadian citizens of all kinds of stripes. So, Indigenous data sovereignty, as I said, very useful in the international context. Also relevant in the Canadian context, with this one caveat. It needs to be understood that when we talk about Indigenous peoples in Canada, that's simply the latest collective noun we use to describe the distinct First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation experiences in Canada. And within First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, there are their own complicated diversities as well. In the case of First Nations, there are some 630 First Nations or First Nations bands or First Nations governments. In BC alone, there are 30 plus languages. So this complexity is essential. We have to drill down through these complexities. And one of the starting points needs to be nomenclature. It needs to be well understood what we're talking about when we use terminology like Indigenous. In the Canadian context, it's always advisable to refer specifically to First Nations data sovereignty. And then for Inuit and the Métis Nation, delineate, be distinct in how you refer to their approaches to data sovereignty. We could put sovereignty in air quotes when we talk about the different approaches by these distinct nations and peoples, because even that word sovereignty can be complicated. For First Nations, we can talk about inherent, constitutional, and treaty rights, and that latter piece, treaty rights, is not something that Inuit and the Métis Nation talk about. So sovereignty is understood differently by Indigenous peoples in Canada, in these lands we now call Canada. Nonetheless, they are exercising their own definitions of what it means to be sovereign peoples in these lands now called Canada. And again, I'm going to defer to representatives, directly representative bodies for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for that conversation. I can say this, Indigenous data sovereignty is an essential concept with all of those drill down elements I talked about. It is an essential concept in any conversation about open data, open government, open science. By the same token, the open conversation is essential in the conversations around Indigenous data sovereignties or First Nations, Inuit, and or Métis Nation approaches to data sovereignty. Because by necessity, we have to figure out how the principle of open applies to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation governments and their citizens. So it is if not a two-way street, it is certainly essential to understand how each element is important within the other element. Open as a principle is a wonderful and laudable principle. But my colleagues, now former colleagues, and many others are still asking the same questions I asked of you as a group back in 2019. While laudable, we have to ask the question, open by whom, for whom? So, in 10 minutes, we really don't have enough time to fully unpack the history of First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples in Canada. But it's, I think, well understood at this point, certainly following significant recent developments like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its 94 calls to action, the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as Canadian law, UNDA. Canadians, and certainly experts like yourselves, should be well versed in these things, or at least well versed at an introductory level, and have the knowledge that you need to dive deeper into these issues, because that question, open by whom, for whom, is essential. First Nations in particular, living under the Indian Act, as do Inuit in their unique way, as do Métis in some unique ways as well, have lived for now centuries under what we might call the Canadian legal regime. Within that, there is the Canadian Information Governance Regime. Brenda talked a lot about some of that legislation, the Privacy Act, the Access to Information Act. All of these things throttle First Nations' ability to exercise true sovereignty, true data sovereignty, let alone true sovereignty as nations. So this is the big picture we need to acknowledge, because First Nations live under Canadian legislation, including a piece of legislation that other Canadians do not live under, the Indian Act. This legislation has and will continue to impact how First Nations can exercise sovereignty and, by extension, data sovereignty. So some of the work that my colleagues at FNIGC and I did was to develop and deliver a national First Nations national First Nations data governance strategy. And at the center of that strategy is the establishment of a First Nations-led statistical system. Now, how can a First Nations statistical system exist under current Canadian legislation if, as I've already said, it throttles the ability to exercise sovereignty? Well, that is one of the big questions going forward. So in the nation-to-nation relationship between First Nations and Canada, that's one of the issues that needs to be worked out. There is support right now in the implementation of the first phase of that data governance strategy. There is support for moving towards the point on the horizon that we identified, but subsequent stages of this development, and as I said, please go see the work that my colleagues at FNIGC are continuing to do. In order to move forward, we are going to have to take on these questions of how do we ensure that First Nations can truly exercise sovereignty around their information when so much historically and contemporarily, so much information and the right to control that information rests in the hands of the Canadian government and to varying degrees, provincial and territorial governments. So First Nations, Inuit, and Métis can work within Canadian systems, but only to certain degrees. They cannot express sovereignty. And where I used the word principle earlier around open, it's important to remember that there is a 25-year history of the by First Nations, for First Nations set of OCAP principles. And I hope you're all familiar with the OCAP principles. Again, 25th anniversary this year. OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. I talked quite a bit about that 4 years ago. It remains as relevant then as it was now. The true exercise of ownership, control, access, and possession by First Nations is not possible in under certain types of legislation within certain types of Canadian institutions, whether it's Statistics Canada or any one of the line departments of the federal government, where the authority in law rests with the minister and not with First Nations. How can OCAP truly be asserted? I'm going to go back up to the international level now and acknowledge that there's two other sets of principles that you're probably familiar with. There's the FAIR guiding principles for scientific data management and stewardship. FAIR standing for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's a more recent set of principles. And even more recent than that, there's a set of principles that are now stewarded by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and that's the CARE principles. CARE standing for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. This Global Indigenous Data Alliance, of which FNIGC, my former colleagues, are a member, acknowledges the importance of this truly Canadian development, this truly First Nations in these lands called Canada development, and that is the OCAP principles. So that work over a quarter century to advance OCAP, and of course the decades before it to reach the point where the OCAP principles could be brought forward, we could talk about 30, 40, maybe even 50 years of work around these ideas that led to the establishment of the OCAP principles, and now others around the world are taking these up. So whether it's FAIR principles, which are much broader, not exclusively Indigenous, or the CARE principles, which are exclusively Indigenous, and they are following the definition that Indigenous data sovereignty reinforces the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. That's from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. We have these solid foundations. Nonetheless, it doesn't change the fact that we have to answer the question, open by whom and for whom. So if a First Nation was truly sovereign, the answer to the open by whom, for whom question would be quite simple. It would be open by the First Nations government for its First Nation citizens. And of course, that's really a loop we're talking about here. It's First Nation citizens having put forward and or supported the principle of openness and having First Nations government act on it. So open by First Nations for First Nation citizens. But we do have to ask ourselves if that's where we are. Where do First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation interests reside within the Canadian context? And as I said, that legal regime, the information governance regime that is Canada's information governance regime, is not going to be dismantled in its entirety. First Nations need to build their own system, and we need to work out how those two systems can work together in support of each other. This is the nation-to-nation relationship. And so, as I said, I know a lot more about the First Nations perspectives on this because I did that work for 5 years. But Inuit and Métis Nation colleagues have expressed similar principles, and there are certainly in the conversation we can direct you to sources for that. I want to segue in the last couple of minutes that I have here to talk a bit about the context that I work in at the Canadian Museum of History. So the Canadian Museum of History exists under a piece of Canadian legislation, enabling legislation. It's a Crown corporation. We are independent from government, but of course we derive our mandate from the federal government. Our Board of Trustees recently put out new strategic directions, and I want to highlight two of them here. And I think that they're quite notable because they speak to what we've been talking about together and what I've just been talking about for the last couple of minutes. So one of the new strategic directions is advance reconciliation and strengthen our commitment to recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. So naming reconciliation and naming rights of Indigenous peoples in a strategic direction is a significant development for us. Not to say we haven't been doing years of work in nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations around repatriation, and Indigenous relations. But it's very significant that it's now in a strategic direction for us, and we'll soon be announcing more work to advance that work. And then there's another one that says leverage technology to drive innovation and deepen access to museum activities. And that's the openness piece. So we have a commitment to repatriate. Our longstanding repatriation policy is currently under review to be up to date with international and Canadian Indigenous perspectives on where we need to be. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up with this. A museum like ours, we are the Museum of Canadians. We will be looking to make we have always looked to make our collections open, and we will continue to do that. There is a digital divide. There is a capacity divide that we have to close the gap on to make that realistic. But nonetheless, these are important focuses for us. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I look forward to seeing if there are questions or comments, and happy to direct you to resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Really appreciate you as well. And we actually only have about 10 minutes left. We're a bit of a timeline, of course, for our next group to come into the waiting room. So we only have about 10 minutes. So there isn't much room for actually questions and dialogue. We could certainly do another session, perhaps as a webinar in the future. I really think it's probably important that you have a chance to summarize a bit. And I just want to direct your focus on a summary. I think actually what Jonathan was saying about asking questions years ago and you still need an answer, words like sovereignty, control, governments, it brings up trust in government, the privacy issues that Brenda talked about. I believe the Open Government Partnership can be kind of an assist to us all in our processes, be it AI or open data, perhaps bridging a gap. I think trust is a key issue, though. So I also like the ownership, control, access, and prevention. And I think First Nations issues should be really high on everyone's agenda, as well as the government. But there's shared issues there, right, for all citizens, really, when it comes to especially artificial intelligence and their privacy. So there's some symmetry in our conversation this morning that you're providing to us. And I went to the link that Brenda put, and just an example I think the governments need to be aware of. There really isn't clarity when the next meeting is going to happen. You can contact the committee, but there is no information actually as to a meeting. And I used to work for the government of the city of Toronto, and I felt we were doing a great job, notifying citizens of when things were happening. But when I became just a citizen again, I realized that there's a lot of flaws in that process. So I think for those viewing who are members of government, consider how you do communicate with the public. I think that's important to add. So just as a summary, I'd like to go with Brenda, Rudi, and Jonathan, the order that we spoke. If you could just summarize some quick thoughts around those ballpark issues: trust, sovereignty, privacy, ownership, control. And we'll start with Brenda, if you will. And again, we've got about 5-6 minutes for that. So if you can be brief, that'd be great. But Brenda, would you take it away?
Sure. I think I'm struck by Jonathan's question, open by whom, for whom? And I think to me that is a question that creates a thread across those issues of trust and privacy and control and accountable openness. When we are trying to action our shared commitment to using information for public good, we have to keep in mind, and Jonathan's comments this morning highlighted this with crystal clarity. Canada is a diverse place, and across the diverse set of interests that people in Canada have, there will be different priorities, there will be different needs, there will be different perceptions of what openness means, and there will be different impacts of openness and the leveraging of data, depending on who you are and where you live, and whether you are more central, whether you are someone in either as an individual, as a member of a group who exists more in the margins of society. So these conversations about openness, to some degree, and I thank Jonathan for reminding me of this, need to be open, need to be granular. It's one thing to say open is good. It's another thing to ask open by whom, for whom. So I just would center on that question as we proceed through all of the different topics today, as a really important grounding.
Thank you, Brenda. Rudi, comments?
Thank you. I think I'm going to repeat my original idea. I think the distance that we still have at the local level on these issues, as you mentioned, trust, sovereignty, control, really require a larger focus to work in these capacities at the local level. This is where sometimes these issues are feel there is a distance, there is not a connection. So I think we really need to sort of pull more work and more capacity building at the local level to make sure that that question that Jonathan was proposing on who is controlling, etc., gets more people aware of the question itself, because sometimes these issues are so fly at so high level at the national level that sometimes in the local level where issues become more granular and more simpler, probably we don't even think about it. So that awareness, I think it's much of the work that we need to do in order to make sure that the local level it's represented and invested in. And this is a double responsibility, especially for the national governments, to make sure that the ones that basically control the money can make sure that those capacities are grown at the local level.
I think it's a very good point too. You know, sometimes we forget we have 3 levels of government, right? Municipal, which is very local, right outside my place here. You know, that's local. Then we got provincial, of course, who deals with our province. But then we have to deal with the federal level too, and provinces may think differently, and people living in provinces may think differently. So good points there. And final words will go to Jonathan. It's nice to end with you, I think, because you brought up some very interesting topics for us. So.
Well, yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And again, deferring back to colleagues across the Indigenous communities in Canada, I think is really important. And I just want to say this, I was tasked with asking that question. So it's a collective ask. The words themselves came from my friend and colleague, Gwen Phillips in British Columbia, who's the BC Data Governance Initiative champion for First Nations in British Columbia. But it is a collective ask, and all Indigenous representative bodies are asking that question. So I'm glad it's landing, and those OCAP principles and other principles are familiar to people. In terms of the question of trust, I mean, I don't think it's difficult for anyone to understand why trust is low for Indigenous peoples in Canada. I mean, there's a history, there are royal commissions, there has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If we haven't delved into those things, we must. And so it's in this area, reconciliation is not a two-way street. It is Canada's and Canadians' responsibility to repair trust. We can get there, and there are good examples of how we have gotten there. For example, this federal government's support for First Nations implementation of their data governance strategy and the future establishment of a First Nations-led statistical system is an example of that. But we have a lot of work to do. We have that terminology of reconciliation, but it goes much deeper than that. So I'm very pleased to have shared with you. Thank you.
Likewise, we appreciate all of your comments today. And of course, the word control comes into play in webinars. I have some control here about how we're going to wrap up. So we're pretty good for time. I really appreciate that as well from your end. And we will have to invite you back. I think we can do a lot more deeper dives and also get our audience involved if we allow some time for that kind of dialogue. So thank you once again. Hope you have a great day, and stick around if you can for the rest of the conference. Coming up after our break, we're going to have a data equity panel, which I think moves right nicely after what we were just talking about here today. So once again, Brenda, Rudi, and Jonathan, thank you so much for your participation. And we'll take a 15-minute break now. And there's a new link folks should have received in their email to get into the data equity panel, which will begin at 10:30. So we'll see you in 15 minutes. And thanks again, Brenda, Rudi, Jonathan, really appreciate it.